Welcome, please welcome
to another episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast, your number one construction industry resource. Hear conversations with industry professionals to get the tools, stories, and advice that you need to set your career on fire. You're now streaming the Tools of the Trade podcast.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Netsurance Canada. Get instant online quotes for insurance and bonds, even from a cell phone. Guys, it really is that simple. Just head over to netsurance.ca. That's netsurance.ca for all of your insurance and bonding needs. What's up, guys? Thank you for tuning into another episode. And here we are, another month of Tools of the Trade. I'm your host, Colin Toop. And this month, I've decided to do something similar to last month. So last month being Residential Builders Month, and this month is what I am calling Project Management Month. Just a disclaimer, this will be my last month of batching episodes together. It was a little experiment that I was trying with the podcast to see if I could drive different perspectives from different areas of the construction industry. But this month is jam-packed. So we have 4 amazing guests for you, and they are talking from different sides of the project management industry. So from being more on the ground to the client side to the consulting and training side. And that brings me into the first guest of Project Management Month, a gentleman by the name of Bob Mattia. And Bob is a very passionate and very professional former project manager who is now retired, and he consults for Eris project management software, as well as Procept, which is a consulting and training company based out of Toronto, and he does a little bit of work with them still. But Bob was one of the people that fell into project management and ended up loving it. He is classically trained through university, which is not the way that most of us fall into or decide upon project management, but he helps really understand what project management is from a granular level. And that is essentially knowing quantities and numbers of things that are to be installed and managing all stakeholders and all expectations effectively to get those things installed on time and on budget. Bob is a wealth of information, and he has written quite a few articles in the past, and I am going to be distributing those articles throughout the month at toolspodcast.com on the blog, and you can check out all of the great resources about mitigating risk and all sorts of other things about project management that Bob has written about in the past. There's a ton of value, not in this episode, not only in the other 3 episodes I'm going to be releasing, but in this content as well specifically. So please feel free to check that out. And without making you wait any longer, here is my conversation, my wide-ranging conversation with Bob Mattia. Bob, welcome to Tools of the Trade.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Colin. Nice to spend a little time with you.
Yeah, likewise. And I'm so excited to chat with you. As some people know, I haven't talked about it too much, but I am a PM. So I'm in the throes of things as a project manager. And I have a lot of questions. I read a lot of your work and articles, and there's been some great stuff there. So we're going to swim our way through project management and hopefully touch on some things that people can get value from and apply to their daily project management careers. And the first place I wanted to start listeners off with was a 2-part question. I wanted to hear your definition of project management and how that's evolved over the years.
Well, that's interesting because what I learned project management was defined as being in charge of the entire process from inception to handover. And that's the true definition of project management. You're basically starting at the very beginning, at the point where an idea surfaces, and going through all the steps of the planning and scheduling, cost planning, budgeting, determining all of the parts that play into the whole process of bringing this project to fruition. And then babysitting it, managing it, doing everything necessary to bring it to its final conclusion and hand it over to your customer. And then that's the end of it. Because a project manager manages a project. It's not a lifetime project. It is a time-defined piece of work.
And you got to deliver that on time, hopefully on budget.
Correct. Those go without saying.
Now that you have this involvement with a software company and you're seeing the way that project management is taking new approaches with technology and AI and all these things, has the definition changed at all? Or is it still the same, but less responsibilities are put on physical people and more of it is put on software?
Well, people are still responsible. The software, I always look at the software and methods as just tools. A tool will not do the job. You can have the newest tool in the industry and it's sitting there. If you don't know how to use it, it's not going to do the job. The only thing the tool can do is help you be more proficient, more efficient, reduce time, perhaps cost. So again, those tools are not changing the definition. They're strictly helping you to become more efficient at becoming a project manager. So, you have to see those technical advances as helping you achieve the goal of project management.
Yeah, it makes sense. I witness that every day. There's always something new that you're able to apply that helps you organize better. And it still doesn't take away from you having to do your due diligence and deliver on that project as the PM. How did you come to the decision that you wanted to major in project management? It seems as though that's kind of a different way that somebody would approach the field. Was it something that you knew inherently that you wanted to do?
It's funny, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect. I used to draw. I draw for my friends. I draw houses because I enjoyed art. I still do. I like to draw. And I always had this aspiration to be an architect. And when I finished high school, I applied to 3 architectural schools in Ontario. Waterloo invited me in for an interview. I went to the interview and I was sitting around in the lobby with like a dozen other prospective students, and we were comparing our portfolios. And it was at that moment I realized that architecture was really not in my in my future. I just didn't have the artistic ability that I saw amongst the rest of the guys that were there and students that were there. So I had to rethink my strategy. And I did a little research and I found out that Ryerson was providing a course called architectural science. Well, the word architecture got my attention. So I looked into it and it turned out that it had a program that taught you architecture, it taught you building science, and it also taught you project management. Your first 2 years were a general, you got a little bit of everything. After 2 years, you had to decide which stream you wanted to go through. You wanted to go into architecture, did you want to go into building science, or project management? I learned, particularly in high school, that I did an aptitude test, and one of the things that it came up was that I was very good in persuasion. I don't know why, but anyway, that was what the guidance counselors told me. So I thought, you know what? I think I'm going to go the project management route because I knew the architectural route wasn't going to be good for me, and I wasn't crazy about building science, even though I did really well at it because we had this instructor who was a civil engineer, and we used to design beams, concrete, and steel, and I was always getting A's in it. But I kept thinking, I want to do this for a living. So I chose project management, and I turned out that I loved it. I enjoyed it, and I said, this is what I want to do. I just want to be in charge of projects. And so we learned all the project management techniques. And one of the interesting things I learned was planning and scheduling, because I determined in planning and scheduling was the one stream where you could learn about the entire industry and how it comes together, because you had to focus on every part of the project. And when I started learning planning and scheduling, we were still doing hand drawings, CPM hand drawings. Computers were just starting to come onto the scene, and we had to use computers with punch cards. And the punch cards had one activity on it, one relationship on it, and you had to punch 1,000 cards to create a schedule.
Wow.
Yes, and you had to take these cards to these typing centers, and you'd go in and you'd give them basically a list of everything that needed to be punched on these cards. And, it was usually manned by ladies, and they would punch these cards for you. You'd run them through the computer, and then you'd find errors. And you'd have to go and find those cards that had the errors on them and correct them.
Wow.
I know. It was crazy. And that was the first start of computerized scheduling. So after that, when I graduated, I said, I want to get into, I want to manage projects. I want to get out and manage projects. Well, it wasn't that easy, obviously, because it takes a while to get to the stage where you can manage projects. But I worked for my uncle. He was a civil contractor, and I worked for him for a little while. And then finally, I got my first job, and it was in Niagara Falls. A buddy of mine who took the same course, he was working for an engineering company. He said, "Hey, would you like to come and join us?" And they've got a position in the planning scheduling department. Well, I just hit pay dirt and the rest was history. From there on in, I moved from planning and scheduling up through the ranks. I got doing superintendent work, you name it, right on up to the level of project management.
One of the things that I heard in your voice there was you said, I loved project management. What exactly did you love about it? If you look back on it, like what got you out of bed to get there? What was that one underlying thing that you really latched onto?
I'm one of those OCD types. I like to solve the problem. And I always was inspired by looking at a set of drawings and saying, we're going to build this. And it was always a challenge to build it within the time frame and the money. So to me, it was a challenge. And the challenge was to get it done through the efforts of people, because that's what it's all about. And in the planning and scheduling part of the picture, I was able to sit down and put that project together on paper, which just was phenomenal to me. I would have to sit with superintendents and foremen and whatnot and understand their business. And it taught me a lot about the construction business. And I was just a sponge for information when I was early in my career. I loved it. And every day it was just another challenge to see things get built and get done and learning and just learning and continually learning. I mean, it never ended, even to the day when I decided, okay, I'm through with the construction industry as per se. I was still learning right up to the last day because we were doing things that I'd never done in the past.
It's a cool part of the industry for sure. You just when you think you know it all, something else comes. And you took an approach outside of trades to get into project management. And I've heard some people, let's just say that there's a constant battle on sites of people saying that it's better if you come from a trade background and getting into project management. And I disagree. I think, sure, if you're getting into a specific trade, obviously there's a benefit of knowing how it goes together before you get there. But you didn't take that approach. So, what's your opinion on somebody that's thinking of becoming a PM, but doesn't have a trade background and isn't sure which way to go?
Well, for a person that doesn't have a trade background, I mean, I can only speak for how I learned. And if you can get some formal training in terms of project management, because if you try and go out and learn the business by experience or hard knocks, or, what can happen is you can learn bad habits. And that can be a detriment to your future if you learn bad habits. So it's good to get some formal training, but then mix that up with experience and learn. I mean, never be afraid to ask questions. Talk to the guys who are doing the work, the guys who are turning the wrenches. People are a huge source of information and knowledge if you're just willing to go out there and extract it from them, because everybody's willing to help. They all want to teach. They're all very proud of their trade, and they want to teach you what they do. And as a person starting out in the field, use that as a resource to help you understand the business and understand each trade. I agree there are some people who came up through the trades and did fairly well, but in many cases they lack some of that formal training that would help them be a better manager. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying they could be better. Quite often they have to hire the expertise that they don't have themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you had some formal training, then you can also learn the nuts and bolts and the technical aspect of the construction industry itself. And you're not going to be biased because you want to know about every trade. So that's the one advantage of coming through the system without having a trade background.
When we talk about formal training, obviously the behemoth out there is the PMP designation, the Project Management Body of Knowledge, or the PMBOK, that's run by PMI. In your opinion, is that the gold standard for project management training?
I think there's certainly an advantage to being involved with those organizations and learning from them. One of the things I always am concerned about is over information, excessive amount of information that can be mind boggling. And, organizations are there to try and push their agenda and constantly be bombarding you with more and more information and techniques and whatnot. And I think you just have to be very astute about stuff like that. Like I said, I studied a formal project management program, and we had class time. We had to do assignments. I mean, we had to do a thesis at the end of the 4 years. And to me, that was valuable, extremely valuable. It was the best investment I've ever made in my life. I'll tell you that right now. It has paid, immense amount of return for me. Would I have gotten that, say, by the PMP PMBOK route? Probably not, because I wouldn't have had the benefit of that one-to-one contact with all my instructors and other people in the industry, because my instructors were all industry specialists.
Mm-hmm.
They came in from their jobs some of the times to teach. So we got a perspective from that formal education that you wouldn't get from reading the PMBOK or going to seminars or things of that nature. I'm not saying that isn't good. I think it is. But again, if you can get some sort of mentorship, you're far better off. And when I graduated, and after several years of working in the business, I approached PMI and I said, there's a lot of folks out there who've gotten formal project management education, and I think you should grandfather them all in and give them PMPs. And they wouldn't have anything to do with that. And so, I never bothered to get my PMP because I said, I've spent 4 years studying, and I didn't think it was necessary for me to get a PMP. And it wasn't. My career was just fine with the education I got. That's not to say that everybody can pull that off, but I'm just saying in my case, that's the way it worked. And I've never looked back in terms of wishing I had my PMP. It's a good thing to have if you've got some sort of training already to back it up with. I understand, what PMP is doing, and I think it's a great effort. But people, really have to recognize the limitations. And it's like anything, if you're going to be a pilot, you're not going to become a pilot by sitting in front of a Microsoft simulator game all your life. You got to get out and actually do some flying.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. But and that's how I kind of view like the PMP and all, is that it's like a simulation, but you got to get some hard knocks experience either through mentorship or being involved with an organization that really knows what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat unfortunate that those 3 letters on the end of somebody's name on a business card or on their LinkedIn profile, it carries weight. Some companies look for it, rightfully so. If you're going to get some training, at least go for the PMP. Maybe you've been in the field already and you need some formal training. That's an avenue, or taking your approach and maybe doing night courses or something like that. But I think a lot of people do get hung up on the designation and the fact that they think that you're going to be able to run through this massive book, write the exam, pay the fees, take the refresher courses, and you're off to the races. And sure, I do think that there's great education that you do receive from these courses, but I think there's more than one approach. And that's what I'm trying to get at here is I want people to understand that there isn't just single avenues into places. I want more people interested in trades. I want more people interested in project management and these types of jobs that we're slowly running out of people to fulfill. And I think it's great that you're able to share that personal experience and the fact that you can take alternate approaches to getting into the field. You don't necessarily have to come from the trades, and the PMP may not be the be all end all. It may look nice on your resume, but if you come from a place like Ryerson, that looks just as good. It doesn't have to be the specific PMP. I know that's just, they have a good marketing program and a lot of people buy into it, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there is alternative ways to get there for sure.
Yeah, and PMI, I mean, obviously they're an organization that are trying to, build their brand, and their focus is not only to educate, but also to sustain and grow and build a war chest of money. And so, you have to recognize that as a person who's getting that PMP. And one thing I wanted to add, when I did approach them, I back in the early days, there used to be these vendors that said, "Hey, get your PMP in 5 days," because what they used to do is basically teach you how to write the exam. And I wrote them and I says, that just doesn't make sense because you're trying to issue a designation, and it just doesn't sound right that you can get it in 5 days. I mean, would you trust a doctor who could get his doctor in 5 days? So they replied and they said, "Yes, you're right. And they stopped the practice. They went to these vendors and said, "You've got to stop doing this." And then I said, the PMP is also a general level of knowledge that you can use in any industry. That when a person comes out with a PMP, that doesn't make them a project manager. It just means that they were able to understand the material and pass a test. That doesn't make them a construction PMP. It doesn't make them an IT PMP. So they went on to provide another class of PMPs now that are more directed towards the industry that you're going to work in, which I thought was a good move because, I get my PMP. It's great. Now, all of a sudden, the IT industry is saying, "Hey, we want a guy who has PMP, or we want a woman who has PMP." That person might not have the knowledge of that industry, but you know what? They know how to manage.
Mm-hmm.
But it may not work very well for that industry because they really don't understand it. So thankfully, they've come up with another designation that can define that you're trained more into the construction industry or whatever industry it may be. But there are more colleges and universities now that are offering construction and project management, and you can get degrees in them now. And I think that's wonderful, because it's going to help the industry.
Yeah, for sure. So now we understand how you became a PM, what it takes to become a PM, all about the PMP. And then we get into a project for the first time. And your company has just won a bid. You've got an estimator that's going to a handoff meeting with you. And then one of the first things you have to do is you have a kickoff meeting. And I wanted to know what you think a PM needs to include in that kickoff meeting and what the overall structure should look like.
The kickoff meeting is an extremely important meeting, and it all depends on the type of organization that you are setting up for. If it's an organization where you've tendered the job and there's contractors involved, you want to get all the players together and basically go over the nuts and bolts of the project. And to prepare for a kickoff meeting, you have to sit down and you have to go over all of the aspects that you need to communicate to everyone so they understand the rules of the game. And that involves safety, which is probably one of the most important aspects of a construction job, is what are the expectations in safety? And you'll go through the detailed list of here's what's going to happen. Here's my individual who's responsible to ensure that everyone is following the rules, that orientations are done, manuals are written, so on and so forth. Then you go into the schedule and you make it very clear what the schedule is all about, what the expectations are in terms of schedule. You might talk cost, but if you've got a lot of competitors sitting at the table, you're probably not going to talk about cost too much. But you are going to say, hey, you've each got your contract, you know what they're worth. Obviously, we're going to try and reduce the number of extras and whatnot. You're going to talk about quality and the specifications. I always consider specifications part of quality because those are basically the physical rules of the install.
Right.
And in that aspect, you're going to talk about things that maybe there might be some questions about, perhaps materials, perhaps methods, anything that could involve the physical structure, the physical aspects. You might want to go over it and clarify it with them to make sure that they understand what the expectations are, and maybe even go through some of the standards so that it's very clear that these what are the expectations. And then you want to talk about meetings. When are you going to hold meetings? Who's going to attend these meetings? And my favorite is always the daily huddle. and I say, hey, every day in the morning, we're going to have a 15-minute huddle, no minutes taken. It's just going to be, us talking about what are today's priorities. And, it's not a discussion period. It's basically me, the project manager up front saying, here's our priorities. Anybody got a problem with these? If you do, you need to have a sidebar with the other individuals. Get those over with. And then anything else that enters into the project. And it all depends on the client and what aspects they want. If you're working in a manufacturing environment that's in operations, you're going to go over in specific detail the rules of operations, how you get to the site, how you get out of the site, what operations you avoid, where are the barriers going to be, hours of work, you know, time, where the punch in time is, where the security gates are, how security is going to be controlled on site, where the laydown areas are, where your trailers are parked, where can you keep the washrooms. I mean, you're going to get down to the nitty gritty because the more detail you can cover in that kickoff meeting, the better your job's going to go because it's understood right from the start. And you want to cover as much information as possible in that kickoff meeting so that everyone is marching to the same drum and you're not having everybody going off in their own directions.
And obviously, you're not including apprentices and field staff in that kickoff meeting, but how far does that go? Let's say you're a single trade organization, maybe an electrical company. You've got your PM, maybe you've got a coordinator, you've got the senior management team, and then you're going to have your general foreman and your foreman. Like, how far down that pyramid do you go before you stop inviting people to the meeting?
It's a timing issue too, because you'd like to get that kickoff meeting scheduled fairly soon after the award because you want to get things going. Customers are always in a hurry, right? So,
Oh yeah.
The minute the purchase order is placed, you're probably going to get an invitation to the kickoff meeting about 1 or 2 weeks later. If you've got your staff in place, you're going to bring as many of them as you possibly can who are in a decision-making situation. So, yeah, if you've got your general foreman, you might bring them if you're a small company because you're not going to expect a huge organization to be there. If you're a larger firm, you're going to have your project manager there, your construction manager, you might have your superintendent, maybe each trade super in there. Again, it's a timing issue and who have you got assigned already. And but it's important, it's very important to have decision makers at that meeting, your safety people, your QA people, your pre-construction people who are going to set your site up and that sort of thing. So it's important to have the right people there because if they miss out on some of the important information, things can go wrong. Particularly what happens is if somebody misses a discussion about how they get from point A to point B in a plant that's operating and things go wrong and you inadvertently shut down a line or affect operations, that goes right to the top of the plant pretty quick.
Oh yeah.
so already you're already been given a black mark if you've done something contrary to what was instructed in the kickoff meeting. So it's important. It's important to have the right people there.
One of the things you touched on was the daily huddle. And this is something that I learned from a business coach a few years ago when I had my business. And I've also read about it in Japan. They have something called a chore. And I'm sure I butchered that. If you're Japanese, please forgive me. But it's the morning assembly for all employees. And it's a quick 10 to 15-minute thing where everybody gets together. They get up to speed on what's going on that day, where the hurdles and roadblocks are. Like you said, it's not minuted, and then they disperse. But I wanted you to go in a little bit more detail about that so that anybody listening could put one together themselves on their project or within their company, whether it's a 2-man shop or a 200-man shop that's going after a big job. How do you structure it, and what sorts of things do you present and bring forth besides, obviously, the daily task?
The huddle kind of can follow sort of the same format as, say, a weekly meeting, but not to the huge depth that you would in a weekly meeting. What I used to do is I used to have a board, and it was a big whiteboard or corkboard with whiteboard attached. And part of the preparation was each of the contractors, depending on which trade they were taking care of. If it was the piping contractor, I would ask every week that I wanted to see their set of drawings stuck to that cork board, and I wanted them to yellow off all the pipe that they've installed that week. And I wanted it on that cork board. In the electrical, I would do the same. I would say, show me which lines you've pulled already, and it would just be general layout drawings. It wouldn't be details.
Mm-hmm.
So that I could get a visual aspect of where we stand. And then I would also insist that everybody give me quantity curves so I knew how much they installed over time. And those curves would be posted on that wall as well. So anyone could go up there and see the progress at any time. Then the whiteboard would be my priority list. And on that whiteboard, I would list priority 1 through 10. And every day, those priorities changed because it all depended on what we were trying to accomplish that day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would create that priority list because I controlled the schedule as well. So I'd list the priorities and we'd basically go through them. So priority 1, today we're going to set equipment so-and-so. Anybody got a problem with that? And here's the spot where it's going to happen. And, we've brought in special equipment to move it from point A to point B. Is there anybody with an issue with that? And if somebody has an issue with it, and you say, okay, what's the issue? Well, I got to hang some pipe there. Okay, well, you guys get together and work out that detail, okay? Any other issues? No? Fine. Now, priority number 2. Today's priority is, we're going to run this pipe from point A to point B because operations need that area tomorrow. And we got it all, in place. Has everyone thought about it? Yep. Okay, everything's good. Great. We move on to the next priority. And then at the end of that, well, first thing I should say is the first thing we do is talk safety. Safety is always top of the list. And in safety, if there was any infractions that the safety rep came up with, we talked about that right off the bat. So we said, hey, yesterday we had a guy, he cut his finger. Apparently, it was a saw or whatever. We need to keep an eye on that sort of stuff. And then one time one of our contractors was having so many safety issues that we just said, all right, after this meeting, we have a stand down. We want to sit down and we want to talk to the contractor and all of his employees. We're going to take 15, 20 minutes and basically, get to the bottom of what's the problem. Why can't we, but we didn't take up the huddle with that. We just said we're going to follow up with it. Once we get through all the priorities, meeting's over. Everybody go off to work. And then what would happen is different individuals would get together and discuss some of the issues that we talked about in that short huddle. But what it did is it gave everybody a task list for the day because it's important. We like to think that, having a plan or schedule that's 2, 3, 4, 6 months, a year long, hey, that's going to control the job. It's not. You got to get down to what's going to happen today because today is tomorrow. Tomorrow is the day after. A week goes by, 2 weeks go by. And if you haven't dealt with the daily issues, they become big. And now, you're delaying weeks and months in some cases. So it's a definite requirement. And that doesn't mean that it has to be done on the floor. Sometimes you can have that over the phone with the same characters because maybe they're not available for whatever reason. I prefer face-to-face because you can read faces, you can read body language, and you can get all of that when it's face-to-face. And when you've got 25 people all standing around you, having a 15-minute huddle, you can see who's got a problem because typically they'll be jumping up and down. It's like, okay, I think we have someone here that's got a problem. But very effective means of managing a construction site.
Yeah, I can see that. Like I'm getting motivated to go put that piece of pipe in on item 2 that you just mentioned. I can feel, and I have felt before, how that really provides direction for somebody that may feel as though they're working on a task, but they're not sure if it is the most efficient task that needs to get done as per the schedule and the next milestone. And they're kind of just swimming through their day, and they may complete their day and they say, well, I think this is what I'm supposed to do. And if you end up going in that direction for too long, you could be, working backwards, essentially.
Yeah, and a lot of the contractors, we would invite their foreman to come to that meeting too, because it helps them as well. It's like you said, instead of walking around that day wondering what they should work on, if they're informed of what the priorities are, man, they just jump in with both hands and they try and get those tasks complete because they know that tomorrow it's coming up again.
Yeah. One of the other things you mentioned in there was your quantity curve. And when we spoke last time, and as I was reading some of your articles, you talk a lot about quantities and installation rates. And unfortunately for myself, I haven't experienced that a lot. And I think that's because some people are numbers oriented and some people aren't. And I wanted to see if you could elaborate on exactly what you feel the quantities and installation rates are and how you use numbers to manage a job rather than looking at a big nasty schedule that could be a couple of years and trying to break it down line by line. How do you deploy the quantity and installation rate method?
So if you got a 1 year schedule and you've got maybe 60, 70 piping activities on that schedule, you can quantify each one of those entries. Suppose you have maybe it's a hydraulic piping. You might have a schedule item called hydraulic piping. You can break it down to be more specific in terms of where's the pipe coming from and to. And hydraulic piping is going to be fairly small bore, but you can still say we've got 1,000 feet of it in this particular schedule activity. So you have 1,000 feet of pipe in that activity, and you've got a series of other activities, and they all have their quantities. So what you do is you total those quantities based on the times. So 1,000 plus 500 plus 500, you have a total of, say, 10,000 feet of pipe, and you've spread it out over the schedule. Now you know that if you've got a 2-week schedule to install 1,000 feet of pipe, you know that at the start of the 2 weeks, it's zero. You know, at the end of the 2 weeks, it's 1,000 feet of pipe installed. So it's a straight line almost. However, we like to use the S curve because we all know that at the start of the installation, there's inefficiencies. And so you're not going to install pipe at the highest rate because you're just getting the job started. So you're going to have an S curve. And the S curve shows that the quantity of installation is low at the start, but then it starts to pick up and it gets up, and then finally it starts to level off again because near the end of the install, productivity goes down in terms of footage again. And so you get an S curve, and that's your quantity curve. So you can chart that. As each week goes by, you start putting down how many feet of pipe you actually install. And if you're tracking along that S curve, you're going to meet your schedule. If you're ahead of that curve, you're going to beat the schedule. And if you're behind the curve, you're going to fall behind the schedule. It's an early warning sign because within 20%, you can tell whether you're in trouble or not, whether you're installing pipe at the rate and the hours that you intended. Same goes for cable. You can quantify the amount of electrical cable on the job. You can quantify it by the type of cable. And terminations. Again, these are all finite numbers. You can add up the number of terminations there are on any project. You can add up the number of cubic yards of concrete. You can add up the tons of rebar. You can figure out how many yards have to be dug for a foundation. Construction's all quantities. It's quantities of things. And we can manage those quantities because if we can install those quantities at the rate that are required in terms of time, then you'll meet your schedule. And that's why I live and die by quantities. Any job I've ever been on, I learned the lesson early in my career because I got on a job where I was beat up, literally beat up. I hated going to the meetings because the project manager would just keep lambasting us in terms of our quantities and saying, you're not meeting your quantities. You're not getting the quantities in at the rate in order to finish the schedule. Plus, your productivity was poor. We had to determine how many hours per foot of pipe we were installing based on our estimate. So if you estimated 1,000 hours and you had 1,000 feet of pipe, you're going to install pipe at 1 hour a foot. If through the job we were taking 2 hours a foot, we're in trouble. We're going to double our estimate, and we're not going to install the pipe at the rate that we thought we would. It's going to take us twice as long to install it, and we're going to burn up twice as many hours. And we used to get beat up over that every week we did a recovery boiler up in just west of Sudbury. I can't remember the name of the small town, but oh my God, it was one of the worst projects I'd ever been on. I tell you, it was the weekly beatings. But I learned my lesson, and I learned that quantities is what you need to get your hands on. If you're going to do a project, understand how much of everything you're installing and at what rate you need to install it. If you've got your hands on that information, you can walk around with pure confidence that you're either going to make your dates or you're not, because of the trends that you see in terms of the installation quantities. You can count welds, you can count whatever, steel, siding, roofing, windows, equipment, anything.
Is that something that you formulate at the front of a job? Once you get the schedule in hand and you're turned over and you're given the estimate, is that when you start doing that deep work and really getting in and breaking the schedule apart, breaking your quote apart, and starting to put numbers onto the schedule based on what you estimated?
Yeah, absolutely. And I learned that technique when I worked for Bechtel. When I first started out, I worked for 1 year for Bechtel in Toronto, and they were always given this high status of having a system. People used to call it Bechtel has a system, and no one understood what that was. But when I got in there and I saw what their system was all about, I thought, geez, this is great. No wonder people didn't understand it, because a lot of it was just pure mathematics. And I remember my supervisor, he'd hand me a schedule and he'd give me the schedule that somebody made up, a construction manager made up. And then he'd say, here's all the quantities. Now I need you to spread these quantities across all these schedules. So I'd sit there and I'd work it all out. And by hand, I would write, okay, this schedule's 5 weeks long. And I've got 100 feet of pipe. And I would say, okay, or 1,000 feet of pipe. And I'd say, okay, it's a 5-day work week and X number of feet per day. And that's how many you have to do every day in order to get it done in that time frame. But then I learned the S curve thing, and I knew that at the front end I couldn't install at the maximum rate, and at the back end I couldn't install at the maximum rate. So in the middle, I knew that I had to go above the average rate in order to meet the date. And that's where I got my training from Bechtel, and I never lost it. I did that on every job. As soon as we got the job, I took the estimate, and the estimate always had the quantities right on there. You talk to the estimator and say, hey, what were the quantities and all. And I created the schedule, so I knew how to put it all together, and always worked well for me. And then I would just use an Excel package to create the S curves and the bell curves and all of that. But again, these are the kinds of things that you probably don't learn from, say, like a PMP or even in course, because they never taught us in school that technique. That I learned in the field.
Shout out to Bechtel for that one.
Oh yeah, big time, big time. For the short period of time I was at Bechtel, I learned a lot of stuff. It was amazing. It was a great company to work for at the time.
Are they still around?
They are, but they do a lot more work overseas now. They do a lot more work for the U.S. government overseas and the war torn zones and places like that.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you, and it seems like this, now that you got me in the mindset of quantities of things, and you have that plotted on a schedule, is that how you would then forecast your resources and when they need to be on site at the optimal time, whether it's just in time delivery for material or whatever the case is for your job? Once you lay those out, it kind of seems like it all falls into place from there.
Yes, that's true. Because part two of the quantity spreading of materials, part two is spreading the resources along the same schedule. So, if it's piping and you know that what's been estimated is an hour a foot, so you've got 1,000 feet of pipe over a 2-week period, you got 1,000 hours to do that work. And so now you spread those hours in the same fashion as you do the quantities. This is how you load up your, say, Primavera schedule or P3 or whatever schedule you're using. You load up the resources. You can also load those quantities into the schedule and let the computer do all the math for you. It's incredible, the tools that are available, and if you know how to use them, because the computer, once you've got all the resources loaded in, you go to the computer and it'll kick out that S and bell curve for you, and it'll show you how much you have to accomplish over time and what your resources are needed in order to accomplish that task. So if you understand that technology in the scheduling platform, it's an amazing amount of information that helps you run the job.
No kidding. And I could see this even being applicable to a small contractor that's even building a house. If you're an electrician, you're building a house, there's only a finite number of items that need to go in there. And you're on a compressed schedule to get that thing done. It just makes sense to me.
Yep, No, absolutely. I mean, if you're an electrician building a house, you've got X number of outlets and switches and so many feet of cable and terminations. You can do the math real easy.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science.
Well, thank you for sharing that. From your experience of working on multiple jobs, I'm sure you've had great jobs. I'm sure you had jobs that weren't so great. From your experience, where do most projects fail?
There are several places that a job project can fail. One is right in the estimate. If the estimate is not right, you're in trouble.
As a PM, we like to say it was the estimate, but as the estimator, they like to say, no, it's the way you manage the job.
That's right.
So maybe you're being biased.
Well, I'm just saying that is one.
Okay.
I've been on a project where it was sorely underestimated, and it ended up in a huge claim that took years to settle.
Uh,
And we could do a podcast just on that project because I learned so much. It ended up going into arbitration. We had to go overseas and fight it in Switzerland and Belgium because we were dealing with a German company, and it was a $16 million claim. So
wow.
yeah, and we underestimated. It was basically our own fault because we took on more than we could handle, and it hurt us. But that's one. The other is just communication's another big one. If you don't have good dynamics on a project, even if it's a good project, things can go wrong because the relationships aren't working. And that can create problems for people. If you've got managers who are authoritarian, are not good communicators, things go wrong. I mean, you find that at home. If you don't communicate well with your wife, things go wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so it can happen on a job site. So communication is usually a big one when it comes to potential failures. Another one is not having a proper organization. If your organization isn't built to deal with the circumstances, if you've got people in the organization that are inexperienced or unaware or not familiar with the challenges that they're going to be facing, they're going to be stumbling through it. There'll be incompetence, and that may not be the person's fault. It may be whoever assigned them to that job. It may be their fault. They assigned the wrong people, and things can go terribly wrong when you have the wrong personalities, the wrong skill sets on a project. And those are hard to fix because if you have a limited supply of resources in your organization and nobody has got the experience or knowledge to deal with a project, things can go terribly wrong. And, a lot of money gets lost. Poor planning, if the job isn't planned properly, if the organization isn't set up properly, if the communications are bad, all of these contribute to failures. And the bigger these projects get, the more you need the right people in the right places doing all the right things. And it's easy to say, it's hard to do. It's hard to do.
Yeah. Especially with the labor shortages and trying to staff people, you could run into the same thing. You may not have the guy or the girl that you need in the office. You go out to the street to get them, and you got to try them out somewhere, and it could be on a job that just doesn't end up working out.
We've had situations where we've had senior people as superintendents on our projects, and we've had to fire them because of just the things they did that were so counterproductive, because they felt like they could do no wrong. And you can't have those kinds of personalities. You got to have people on your project that are working together, that work together, leave their personal issues aside and recognize that we're here to accomplish a goal together, and make sure that people are competent in their functions as well. I mean, you don't want to have a person who's, doing estimates for extra work that doesn't know how to do a takeoff, because he's going to always underprice or overprice the work, and there's no consistency. So you might lose money on extras because the person assigned to looking after that is not very good at it. And or you might have a project manager who's been used to doing $2 and $3 million projects, and now all of a sudden he's been assigned a $25 million project. And they say, oh well, it's just a little more money, but complexities increase when you go from small projects to larger projects. There's more people to deal with. There
Hmm.
are more unknowns that have to be addressed.
Have you ever struggled with micromanaging? I feel as though when people become competent at their position, it's hard for them to relinquish control. And I've had this conversation with other people in the past. And I find that it's hard for business owners to get off the tools and work on their business. It's hard for PMs to relinquish control to coordinators and schedulers because it's their baby, and a lot of people think that nobody can do it as well as I can. But also the double-edged sword is that may be true, but you also can't do it alone, especially on a big job. Do you have any advice for somebody that can't let go?
It's a tough one because it comes down to trust. If you don't feel you can trust an individual to accomplish a task, then you micromanage. And it takes a project manager a fair amount of time to build enough confidence and have the ability to delegate and let people make mistakes. It's tough to do, and it takes time and maturity for a manager to get to that level. Because, I mean, like with everything in the world, there's a certain amount of tolerance. And as a manager, you've got to recognize that not everybody does things as well as you do. I mean, we all think we do our jobs better than anyone else, right? And no one
Oh,
could ever do
yeah.
that, right? But what you have to recognize is that there has to be a level of tolerance because we were all newbies at one time ourselves. Somebody had to give us an opportunity to do what we do. And I'm sure they stood there and, shook their heads every once in a while when we were learning to do things and going, oh man, I could do it myself better. but that's where it comes down to is it takes personal training and to build the confidence and recognize that you've got to let people make mistakes. Now mind you, you also have to recognize that there's a limit to what kind of mistakes they can make, and you've got to let them kind of grow into it a little bit. And you've got to get to the point where you recognize that now they're at a stumbling position, and now you might interject some ideas to help them get back on track. But if you're over their shoulder constantly, they will always make mistakes because they'll never do it as good as you. And that's the problem. And people fear it because now they think they're being scrutinized. And so they are just going to make mistakes because there's so much scrutiny going on. Someone can be trusted. It's because you know what they will do under any circumstance. And that's when you know you can trust someone because you know what they're going to do no matter what the circumstance. And if they come up against something they don't know what to do, what's their response? They're going to come to you. They're going to come to you. And that is the sign that you can trust them because they're not going to go out and be a loose cannon and do something stupid or something on their own. And that's when you know that you've gained their trust. And then you can kind of let go a little bit and let people do their thing because you know that when they come up to something they can't handle, they're going to come and see you.
That's good advice. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But it takes work to get to that point for a manager to be able to let go like that.
Yeah. You know what? Even personally at home, sometimes if there's something that I feel that I'm better at, I feel like I'm the one that needs to do it. And it's hard because you have to be okay with that, whatever it is, 5 to 10%.
Yeah.
That, and I think another thing to just add to what you said is the 80-20 rule. 20% of things get you 80% of the results.
Yeah.
And if you're okay with that rounding error in there and you can let it slide, knowing that it's most likely going to be okay on the back end, then it's so hard to let go. I've dealt with it. I'm sure you have, and a lot of other people listening, I'm sure, are dealing with it right now. And that kind of segues into the next question I wanted to ask you is how has your project management skills translated into your daily life?
Well, my wife was always on me because I'm so well organized that it appears. I still conduct my life as if I'm still working. I try and make sure everything's organized. I've got files all set up properly so I can retrieve them as quickly as possible. I still keep my day timer. I'm still filling in information in my day timer. And I use the techniques that I learned in project management. I'll schedule my days. I make task lists because I don't like to rely on my memory as much as I once did. So, and I find it's less stressful if I can reduce things to paper. I got an iPhone. I learned how to use the calendar in the iPhone. Now my whole life revolves around the calendar in my iPhone. Like
Yeah.
even tonight's podcast is in my iPhone. And
As it should be.
yeah, and I would set it to give me alerts. That an hour before it alerted me that you've got a podcast. So I still live by the same rules that I worked with. I mean, it helps out in my daily life.
Is there any major projects that you've deployed project management skills on in your daily life? Like, I don't know if you were a PM by the time you got married or not, but that seems like a big undertaking, managing a wedding or something like that.
Well, yes, for sure, because wedding is obviously it is quite an undertaking, and there's a lot of people involved, and you've got to schedule them all and make sure that that the timing is right. They appear the day they're supposed to. They set up when they're supposed to. You've got caterers. You've got you know tent people if it's outdoors. You've got washrooms that have to be taken care of. You've got food. You got all sorts of things, and yeah, all of that requires project management skills. Recently, I did some work here. We have a lot that has a dock, and I had to build a little gazebo on it. So I sat down and worked out all of the things I needed to do and all the materials I needed, how much I think it was going to take, and so on and so forth. I'll sit down and I'll estimate the amount of effort, time, and cost in getting it done. And, so the skills are good every day. If you were going to build a shed, it's the same thing. You sit down and you figure it all out. I mean, if you got to put foundations in, you've got to order concrete. If the shed is pre-built, you got to go to where they're building it and find out what their schedule is. When are they going to start the manufacturing? Blah blah blah. When's it going to show up on site? Do I need a crane to set it into position, or can we roll it into position? How long is that going to take? What time of year are we going to do it? And I think everybody does it every day, not knowing that they are actually conducting themselves in a project management sort of time frame. And but once you've had the experience and the formal training, I mean, it's just part of your character.
Yeah, it seems like it could almost 10x your life in a way.
Yeah,
And it helps you avoid the mistakes that you would normally make if you weren't so organized.
yeah. And I still like my daughter. Her and her husband, they do renovations, and we do planning over the time frame, how long it's going to take, because we look at the return on investment. We sit down, we do estimates in terms of how much we think it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, what's it going to cost to borrow the money to do the work, and then when are we going to sell the flip, because typically they're flips that we do. When are we going to sell it, and how much can we get, and what's the time frame? So we're still using those techniques even for small personal projects.
Yeah, it's amazing how it translates like that. And I think it is one of the largest skills that we use on a daily basis without knowing it, and it can apply. So if there's anybody out there listening that's thinking of getting into project management, it applies broadly. It's not just your daily life on the job, it's your daily life outside of the job, and it can really help you be efficient. And speaking of that, you touched on your daily journal. And I'm sure your daily journal now is a lot different than it was when you were on site. But when you were on site, what are the key things that you keep in a daily journal as a PM?
My daily journal, there was two parts to it. There was the planning side of it, and then there was the actual side of it. So I would use it as a planning tool for myself, knowing that I had meetings to attend. I used it in terms of what priorities or tasks had to be performed, say, on the job site, and it was all point form. Now, the day timer I have now, it has a month on 2 pages. I used to have a day timer, which 1 page per day, and I would fill that right up.
Yeah.
So, and at the end of each day, I would fill the next day's task list, and down the weeks and months or whatever the case may be. So I would use that to sort of plan out my next day. And then as the day went by, if it was something important, I would write I would, always check off my list. And at the end of the day, I check off everything that got done, and things that didn't get done get pushed into the next day. And so that would be the start of my list of the next day of the things that didn't get done today. And that's just how it ran. I mean, I ran on the day timer in the journal. And then the journal, obviously you wrote down a lot of the actuals because that was information that might come in handy later on, if you were in a dispute or something of that nature.
Right. And speaking of that, I know there's a level of due diligence that has to be kept by a foreman when a foreman keeps their daily log, especially in the event of something unfortunate like a death. Is there a due diligence requirement from a project manager's perspective from a legal point of view?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because, I mean, the project manager is going to set the tone. And if you don't perform your functions in such a way that it identifies to everyone that these are the rules, then you're not performing your due diligence. If there are practices on the job site that are unsafe and you're willing to turn a blind eye to it as the project manager, you're just as responsible as the foreman who let it happen. And with the way safety is now, I mean, there's potential criminal offenses, and everybody is at fault until you can determine who the bad characters are.
Mm-hmm.
So as a project manager, you want to make sure that you communicate the expectations in terms of safety and what you require. And so you're going to have a good safety man or woman who knows the rules and enforces them and helps you with bad behavior that needs to be modified, changed, or you might have to eliminate people who don't want to follow the rules. So yeah, it's serious stuff for a project manager. You have to show, and not just show, but you have to have a passion to make sure people go home every night safe and sound. You do not want to compromise safety for anything. I mean, no job is worth a life. Let's face it.
Yeah, you got that right. As we start to wrap up this conversation, and thank you for so much knowledge that you've been able to leave here today, I wanted to ask you a few questions that are somewhat related to project management. The first one is the next few are just more general about the industry. But the first kind of short answer, rapid fire question I wanted to ask you was, do you think that 40 hours is enough time in a week to successfully be a project manager and manage a job?
Are you talking about project manager only working 40 hours a week?
Yeah. Do you think 40 hours is a sufficient amount of time to get the average large construction job managed correctly? Let's say in the $5 to $10 million range.
I think if you're well organized and you've got the right people on staff, it can be done. For the majority of my career, I worked very hard to avoid weekend work because as a project manager, I always recognize that you have to have more to life than just your job. And it makes you function better if you have time away from work to recharge and spend time with your family, do whatever, because it's going to make you more effective. You're going to be less stressed. You're going to have more energy. And if you've got the right people in your organization, you can hand off some of those responsibilities a little bit. You're still in touch with everything that's going on, but it's just that you're not physically there. And I mean, we had weekend jobs. We had jobs running 7 days a week. And, I would go in on a Saturday. Quite often it was quiet. I mean, quite often you really didn't have much to do, but just kind of keep an eye on things and catch up on paperwork perhaps. But, the work week was really the focus of the job. But if you're on a job where the schedules are tight and they're expecting you to work 7 days a week, and I've always told customers you're wasting your money by working a 7-day work week. It's been statistically proven that you're basically losing money. After 4 weeks of a 7-day work week, you're actually getting less than 40 hours of production. People are tired. They work to what they're used to. And if they're on the job for 7 days, they're giving you what they used to work 40 hours a week, but it's less now because they're more tired. So as a project manager, you got to have the confidence enough to recognize that fact and not get bullied into working so much overtime that's just a waste of money in many times. Now, mind you, if it's your fault that the job's behind schedule, you've got a real challenge on your hands, because as a customer, I would do the same. I'd say, hey, you got to put more hours into the job. But there are some creative ways of doing that without going 7 days a week. I used to push the 4 10s and 2 8s, because Fridays and Saturdays, guys don't want to work. I mean, they want to work, but they don't want to work 10 hours, 12 hours.
No.
So I said, let's do 4 10s, work 10 hours a day, Monday through Thursday, and then 8 hours on Friday and 8 hours on Saturday. And guys were appreciative of that. I mean, I had guys on the tools coming to me and saying, thank you, because they knew that the customer was pushing a 7-day work week. And I convinced them. I said, you're wasting your money, because this was a customer request. They wanted us to work the time, and they were willing to pay the time. And I just kept telling them, save your money. We can get this job done for you, but we don't have to go 7 days. Let's do 4 10s and an 8. I did the math. I showed it to them, and I said, here, based on all the productivity calculations that are out there, you can get it off Google, whatever. I can show you that you'll get the same production and spend less money. So it's doable, but it all depends on the circumstance that you're in. And do you have a staff that you can rely on that, yeah, you can work a 40-hour week? Not easy, because you're thinking about the job all the time. Let's face it, even when you're not on it, you're thinking about things because you're coming up with better concept ideas, whatever the case may be.
That's right.
But I think 40 is a benchmark, but it's not necessarily something you have to hard and fast. You're going to work 50 hours, you're going to work 30 hours, you're going to work 60 hours. But if you're working consistently 6-7 days a week all your life, you're just burning yourself out.
Yeah, that's road to a short career and an early retirement, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite books or resources on project management, or even personal books or resources that you have pulled from or told other people to read or gifted most often throughout your life?
There's one book I read years ago, and I enjoyed reading it. It was the Construction Contractor's Guide, and it was part of the Wiley series. And it was a book about a fella who started his own construction company and then went bankrupt and then started all over again and succeeded the second time based on the errors he made the first time.
Wow.
But it's from the Wiley series. It's an older book, and I can't recall the exact name of it now, but I believe it's the Construction Contractor's Guide or something of that nature.
We'll find it. We'll link to it in the show notes after the podcast is done.
Yeah, I can text you exactly the title and the author and everything, because I've got it written down.
Okay, great.
And the other one that I enjoyed reading too was Good to Great. It's a book I can give you more information on, and it was an interesting read, because basically what it came down to, and they did it in terms of scientific study, that you were better off to promote from within than to bring people in. So it was an interesting read, and those two books I found valuable in terms of just general knowledge. But I mean, there are all kinds of books out there about project management. There's so much information on project management. There's just a wealth of knowledge. And I think they all generally say the same thing. And in terms of how to plan, schedule, cost control, and that sort of stuff. But as a project manager, the technical side of it, you can get books on. The tough part of it is the maturity, is becoming a mature project manager. And that takes time, takes experience, takes building your confidence, and it takes the ability to talk to people and get along with people. And I always remember I had 3 mentors in my life, and I was fortunate to have 3 of them. And one of them was a vice president. And I always remember the saying that he had the ability of stepping on your shoes without messing up the shine. And I watched him operate. He just knew how to give you bad news and made you feel good about
it. That is a skill.
It is. And I learned from that, because I recognized that as a project manager, you have to be trusted. And how do you get trust? Is you have to be honest. If you're honest, even when things are not so good, you'd be surprised how much support you get just by laying it on the table. I found that many situations that were a challenge, all I had to do was just be honest. Hey, we made a mistake. We really screwed up. And, can you help us out? We need some help here. And quite often people are more than happy to help you because you were honest with them. But if you try and hide a bad situation, you just make it worse.
Is there anything specific about the way that he would deliver bad news that you picked up on?
His body language, his expressions, I mean, he didn't look at you and deal with you in a mean fashion. He did it in a more matter of fact. He wasn't trying to demean you. He wasn't trying to make you look stupid. He didn't try and insult your intelligence or anything. It's just the way he delivered the message, and it just made sense. And you just have to agree. Yeah, you're right. Because he was willing to expose something in such a way that it wasn't going to ruin you. You weren't going to be embarrassed by it. So but it takes a bit of talent. It takes a little bit of experience and practice. And you learn to practice those things because you find out when you're dealing with people, the reactions you get. And when you start getting those good reactions, you know that you've hit that spot. You've hit the spot that you need to carry on and then keep developing. So it takes time. It takes time and practice. And once you get into the project manager's level, all those technical skills you've learned, they're great, but it's the people skills that really get you going.
The soft skills.
Yep.
They're hard to learn. You can't teach them, but you just got to find your groove.
It takes time and maturity.
Yep. Bob, is there anything that you would like to leave behind for those people listening? Any tidbits of information, anything to ponder or think about before we sign off?
Well, there was one thing that I learned when I was at Bechtel. I was in the planning and scheduling department, and there was this gentleman that flew in from the head office out of San Francisco, and he come into the office, and he was doing a schedule. We were building a mine up in northern Canada somewhere, and he was putting the schedule together for that job. And so I asked my supervisor, who he was, and he says, "Oh, he's the head. He's the HQ scheduler, project scheduler." I said, "Interesting." So I went over and I sat down and I talked to him, and I asked him. I said, how come they had to bring you in from San Francisco to do this? We've got people here. He goes, "Well, I've been with the company for a long time, and I've learned how to do planning and scheduling, and I've had a lot of experience." I said, "Really?" "Yeah." He says, "Well, how do I get a job like that?" He would fly all around the world doing stuff for Bechtel. And I says, "How do I get to that position?" And he made this statement to me that it's been in my head ever since.
Well, let's hear it.
He said to me, "Just do everything." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "Don't be afraid to take on any task, job, whatever it is." He says, "Just do it. Because once you've mastered it, they're not going to leave you there. They're going to move you up. You're going to move to a new position. You're going to try another task. You're going to learn another function." He says, "And then one day you become knowledgeable about just about every function in that organization. You become a project manager, or you become this person who I am, who I get to fly around and and do these things." And so I took that to heart, and I did. And in my career, I started out planning and scheduling. I did drawing control. I did estimating. I did contracts. I would write contracts. I'd bid jobs. I'd go out for pricing. I took on quality assurance. I was a quality assurance manager on a steel mill in Hamilton. I did anything and everything I get my hands on. I was a commissioning manager for a paper mill. I would run out there and started equipment.
If you think about it, you got to fly to the UAE and work out there.
Yeah.
So
well,
you ended up becoming the guy that gets to fly around and do what he wants.
Well, and that's why I give the same advice to anybody else. I said, don't be afraid to take on any function. I mean, don't get caught up in the fact that you want to be the boss. Do all the jobs, because once you are the boss, you hire people, you know what their functions are, and you can explain to them what the expectations are with clarity because you've done those jobs. as opposed to having some sort of an idea of what those jobs really are. That's something, as someone who's starting out, that's the advice I'd give to someone starting out. If you're further up the scale, I mean, obviously you're not going to go back and do drawing control. But someone who's starting out, don't be afraid to take on those functions. Learn about them. Find out how drawings are filed and how you organize them and so on and so forth, So don't be afraid. Just try everything.
Try it all. Well, thank you so much. If anybody would like to get in contact with you or would like any more information about what you're up to, is there a best place to do that?
You can email me, no problem.
And where would people find your email? Maybe LinkedIn is the best option there.
Yes, or I can give you my personal email. It's rmattia55@outlook.com.
Perfect. And we'll link to all that stuff on the show notes page. There's going to be links to your LinkedIn. You've written a ton of great articles, which I'm going to share for people to dig into and get a bit more information. I tried to contain myself as much as possible into the PM realm so that we could really focus. And thank you so much, Bob, for everything that you provided us. I would love to have you back on because there's so much undiscovered earth here that we could dig around in and figure out things, because you've been in so many different roles and you're a wealth of information. I really appreciate everything that you left for us here today. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, Colin, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed this time with you. And thanks for all these little accolades. I mean, it's nice to hear once in a while.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
That's a wrap. That's a wrap, everybody.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. For show notes, blog posts, resources, and access to our newsletter, check out toolspodcast.com.